In the heart of Enugu, Pastor Chigozie was more than a preacher, he was a father to the community. People lined up outside his small but growing church, drawn by his warm smile and stirring sermons. His wife Ankechi, soft-spoken and graceful, often led the women's prayer meetings. Their children, Somto and Kamsi, were known for their laughter, their kindness, their perfect manners. To many, they were the family everyone wanted to be, but behind closed doors, something unspeakable was unfolding. One night, a scream shattered the silence, and by morning, the town would never be the same. What the police found in a locked room inside the pastor's home was so horrific, so unthinkable, that people still whisper about it in disbelief. What kind of father could do such a thing? What kind of man preaches with blood on his hands? This is the story of Pastor Chigozie, and the truth buried with his children. In the heart of Enugu stood a church that seemed to touch the heavens, not because of its height or grandeur, but because of the man who led it, Pastor Chigozie Nnadi. He was a man you'd greet with both hands, the kind of person who remembered everyone's name, prayed for sick children, and gave food to the hungry without ever calling attention to himself. His words had weight, but never force. His sermons flowed with gentleness, like a stream washing over tired souls. From the local butcher to the university professor, everyone found something in his teachings that gave them hope. People would stop by just to see him sweeping the church compound himself, smiling as though he carried no burden at all. He called the congregation his family, and they responded with deep loyalty. If someone was getting married, he was there. If a child was being named, he came with gifts. It was hard to imagine that behind the soft-spoken voice and humble robes, anything could ever be wrong. To the townspeople, Pastor Chigozie was more than a leader. He was their comfort, their counselor, their spiritual covering. No one questioned his late-night prayer sessions or the way he occasionally traveled without explanation. After all, prophets moved in mysterious ways. The idea that such a man could ever be dangerous was not just unthinkable, it was impossible. And so, the people rested easy beneath his blessings, blind to the storm that was slowly building behind the church walls. What no one knew was that Pastor Chigozie had stopped praying for others long ago. His prayers had taken on another shape, one that would soon stain his legacy forever. At his side stood Nkechi, a woman so gentle and kind that even those who didn't attend church found themselves drawn to her warmth. She had a soft way of speaking, the kind that made you lean in to hear her, and a strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. As the pastor's wife, she took her role seriously, organizing charity drives, counseling young couples, and hosting prayer nights in their modest but beautiful home just behind the church. Together, they had 2 children, Somto, the lively 9-year-old boy with a talent for singing, and Kamsi, the 7-year-old girl who loved to draw angels with wings made of stars. To see them was to see a picture of peace. They held hands when walking to school, sat quietly during service, and always spoke in respectful tones. People would often whisper, "That's how a godly home should look." On Sundays, after church service, the family would serve jollof rice to the congregation, smiling and laughing like they carried no secrets. And perhaps that was what made it all so chilling, because even as Pastor Chigozie's sermons grew darker and his gaze more distant, no one imagined the children weren't safe. No one noticed the way Nkechi flinched ever so slightly when he touched her shoulder. No one asked why Kamsi had started drawing angels with blood on their wings or why Somto had stopped singing in public. The mask of perfection was so well stitched, even those closest to them didn't see the fraying threads. And while the congregation worshipped the image they had built, the family inside was beginning to tremble under the weight of something none of them had the courage to name, something not even prayer could cover. It started as barely a murmur, nothing loud enough to disturb the peace, just quiet talk that drifted between market stalls and under breath at evening gatherings. People began to notice strange disappearances, first a cat, then a neighbor's goat, and eventually a young boy from a nearby village who never came back from an errand. But no one wanted to say too much, especially when the pastor himself led the prayers for the missing. He stood at the pulpit with tears in his eyes, hands lifted to the sky, begging God to bring the boy home. And people believed him. How could they not? His grief looked real. Still, some couldn't shake the unease. A few of the elder women claimed they'd seen shadows moving around the church late at night, long after everyone had gone home. One teenage girl swore she heard strange chants, something that wasn't quite English, not quite Igbo, floating through the air as she passed near the church fence. But when her mother told her to keep quiet, she obeyed. After all, it was Pastor Chigozie. He had prayed for that same mother when she was sick. He had baptized her newborn. Who were they to accuse him of anything? The deeper fear wasn't what he might be doing, it was what it meant if the whispers were true. Because if the pastor could hide evil, what hope did anyone else have? The trust they'd built their lives on would begin to crumble. So, people chose silence, hoping the strange happenings would pass like a bad dream. But silence has a way of feeding darkness. And in the corner of the community, one woman's heart refused to stay quiet. It was Ijoma who first dared to speak. She was Nkechi's oldest friend, the kind who knew her before the title of Mommy Pastor ever followed her name. They had once shared secrets under mango trees as girls and prayers in the quiet hours of their youth. Ijoma had noticed the change. At first, Nkechi stopped coming to their women's group meetings. Then, she stopped answering calls. When Ijoma finally visited, she saw it in her friends' eyes, fear masked with forced smiles, joy dimmed beneath exhaustion. Nkechi had said little that day, only that some prayers come with a price, and that her husband had started praying alone in the locked study more often. Then, suddenly, she disappeared. At first, Pastor Chigozie claimed she had gone to care for a sick relative in Oka, but days passed, then weeks, and no one heard from her. Her phone rang endlessly, her family received no message. When Ijoma confronted Chigozie, he smiled and told her to trust God's process. But something inside her twisted. She remembered Nkechi's trembling hands and the way she hugged her too tightly the last time they met. So she went to the police. Not with accusations, but with questions. They dismissed her at first. Domestic matters, they said. But her word stayed with one young officer, a man whose own mother used to walk miles to attend Chigozie's services. Something didn't sit right with him. And so, quietly, he began to watch. Ijoma's voice, once ignored, had stirred the still water. Something was wrong in that house. And before long, the entire town would be forced to see what Ijoma had sensed all along, that behind the pastor's prayers, there was a cry no one could unhear. The rain fell hard that night, drumming on zinc roofs and soaking the earth until it turned to mud. Power was out across half the town, and most families stayed inside, lighting candles and waiting for the storm to pass. But near the church compound, where the pastor's house stood, something else was stirring. Around midnight, a scream tore through the darkness, high, raw, and desperate. Then another. Not the sound of someone startled, but of someone pleading for their life. Neighbors rushed to their windows, hearts pounding, eyes wide with fear. Some thought it was a robbery. Others believed perhaps a demon had entered the home, but none were brave enough to step outside. Not when it was Pastor Chigozie's house. No one wanted to be wrong. The scream stopped suddenly, as if swallowed by the wind. Silence followed, so complete it made people wonder if they'd imagined it. But one neighbor, an elderly man named Papa Uzo, couldn't sleep. He'd known the pastor since he was a boy. That night, he sat by his window until dawn, watching the house. And he saw it, the flicker of a candle behind the curtains, a shadow moving in slow circles, and something being dragged across the floor. By morning, the town buzzed. People gathered near the church, whispering, worried. When Chigozie finally emerged just after sunrise, he looked calm, too calm. His clothes were clean, his face unreadable. He told the crowd he'd been in deep prayer. Some nodded in reverence, others turned away, uneasy. But Ijoma was already at the police station again, her voice firm this time. Go now, she told them. Something is very wrong. And this time, they listened. That very day, officers approached the house. They knocked once, no answer. They broke down the door. What they found inside shattered the town's faith forever. The house smelled of scented oils and fresh soap, as if someone had tried to wash something away. Officers stepped in carefully, hearts tight in their chests. The living room was spotless, framed scriptures on the wall, a Bible open on the center table. Nothing looked out of place until they reached the hallway. A single door, heavy and padlocked, stood at the end like a silent guard. It wasn't listed in the house's original plan. When they forced it open, what they saw silenced even the most seasoned among them. The air turned cold. On the floor lay a circle of symbols drawn in ash and dried blood. Candles, some burned down to wax puddles, others still flickering, surrounded a wooden table. And on that table were two heads, carefully placed side by side, eyes closed as if sleeping. Somto, Kamsi, the children everyone adored. Their faces, though lifeless, still carried the softness of youth. Around them were torn pages from the Bible, stained and marked with strange writing. There was no sign of struggle, no signs of a break-in, just a chilling quiet and the unmistakable presence of something deeply wrong. Officers staggered back. One wept. Another dropped to his knees. It didn't make sense. This was Pastor Chigozi's home, his children. But there was no mistake. The children were gone, and this was their grave. In the corner of the room, a white garment was folded neatly, placed beside a bowl of thick, dark liquid. One officer touched the wall and felt something behind it, hollow. They would later uncover small bones, animal parts, and a sealed letter written in Chigozi's hand titled, "For the Chosen." But for now, the town outside still waited, unaware that behind one locked door, their image of holiness had just been destroyed beyond repair. When they found him, he wasn't hiding. Pastor Chigozi sat in the backyard beneath the mango tree, eyes closed, hands resting on his knees, whispering scriptures that no longer sounded like comfort. His voice was low, steady, as if he were in the middle of a sermon. When the officers approached, he opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "It is done," he said. No resistance, no panic. Just that eerie calmness that made even the bravest among them feel uneasy. He stood up and offered his wrists without a word. As they cuffed him, he began to hum a familiar hymn, the same one he used to lead every Sunday morning when the church was full and hopeful. Word spread quickly. The church compound flooded with people. Some wept openly, others shouted in disbelief. "Lies," one man screamed. "He's being set up." Another woman fell to her knees, clutching her head. "God, no, not him, not our pastor." It was too much for the town to take in. The same man who had blessed their homes, named their babies, anointed their sick, was now being led away for something unthinkable, and yet, in that moment, no one could deny the truth. The evidence was overwhelming. The horror had a face. Inside the police van, Chigozi looked out at the crowd, but not with shame. There was something else in his eyes, something that made people step back without knowing why. It wasn't madness, it wasn't grief, it was belief. Deep, unsettling belief that what he had done was righteous, and that terrified everyone. Because if a man so loved and trusted could be capable of such darkness in the name of faith, then nothing, no title, no prayer, no pulpit, was safe from suspicion. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from across the country filled the aisles, their cameras clicking, pens racing to capture every detail. But the eyes of the people weren't on the judge or the lawyers. They were fixed on the man in white, seated calmly in the dock, his hands clasped as though in prayer. Pastor Chigozi looked almost serene, untouched by the storm around him. When asked to speak, he did not deny the charges. Instead, he quoted scripture, reciting verses in a voice so steady it sent shivers down the spine. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," he said softly, eyes fixed on no one and yet on everyone. He claimed he had been called to make a sacrifice, that his children were chosen for something higher, something eternal. The courtroom fell into a hush so thick you could hear every breath, every stifled sob. Some spectators wept, others shook with rage, a few, frighteningly, nodded. Among them were members of his former congregation who still believed he was being used by God in ways they couldn't understand. But most were horrified. The prosecutors brought out the evidence, the altar, the drawings, the journal entries, the strange markings on the children's bodies. They revealed that Chigozi had ordered certain spiritual books from underground circles, had been communicating with groups known for their dangerous beliefs. Yet when questioned, he remained calm, offering riddles instead of answers. They belong to God before they belong to me, he said. I only returned what was never mine. The judge's face hardened. The jury looked away. It was no longer just a case of murder, it was a crack in the nation's faith. How could a man so learned in scripture twist it so far? And the real fear wasn't just that he had done it. It was how many others might quietly believe the same. It was tucked behind a row of neatly folded wrappers at the back of a wooden wardrobe, discovered only after the house had been sealed for weeks. The officers almost missed it, a worn leather-bound book with frayed corners and Nkechi's name pressed faintly on the cover. Inside, her handwriting spilled across every page, shaky at first, then growing more frantic with each entry. What started as reflections of a devoted wife turned into the cries of a woman drowning in fear. She wrote of her husband's growing obsession with ancient texts and forbidden rituals he claimed were higher revelations. He spoke of visions, strange, terrifying dreams, where blood opened doors to heavenly realms. Where sacrifice was the key to eternal power. Nkechi begged him to stop, pleaded with him to see reason. But Pastor Chigozie only smiled, telling her she didn't understand the burden of being chosen. One entry stood out. Dated 3 months before her disappearance, she wrote, "He says the children are special, marked by light. But his eyes, those eyes I once loved, now watch them not with care, but calculation." In another, she described waking up at night to chants echoing from the study, her children curled beside her, trembling. The last few pages were smudged with what looked like tears or something darker. Her final note read, "If anything happens to me, to Somto or Kamsi, know this, I tried, I prayed, I warned, forgive me." The journal changed everything. It painted a picture of a woman who saw the monster forming inside the man she married and tried with all her strength to stop him. But faith had bound her too tightly. Love had blinded her too long, and when the town read her words, their hearts broke not just for the children, but for the mother who saw the storm coming and was swallowed by it all the same. As the town struggled to make sense of the horror, something else surfaced, something buried not in words, but in earth. Baba Ekene, one of the oldest surviving elders of the town and a former caretaker of the church grounds, came forward with a confession that shook even those who thought they'd heard it all. With trembling hands and a voice cracked by age and regret, he revealed that years ago, long before Pastor Chigozie ever rose to the pulpit, the land on which the church stood had a history, one that had been carefully hidden, even erased. It was once the site of a forbidden shrine, a place feared for the rituals performed there in the dead of night, when even the wind refused to blow. The shrine had been destroyed when missionaries came, its symbols replaced with crosses, its ground declared holy, but some things don't forget. Baba Ekene remembered helping to seal a pit deep beneath the foundation. "We buried the drums, the bones, the names," he said, "but perhaps we did not bury the spirits." Investigators returned to the church grounds. Beneath the pulpit, they found it, a sealed cavity filled with relics, bones, and items soaked in age and darkness. Chigozie had found it years ago. That much became clear. The deeper truth was harder to face. He hadn't created the evil. He had been drawn to it, consumed by it, convinced he was its chosen vessel. The town was never cursed, but it had forgotten its past. And in that forgetting, it had allowed something ancient to rise again, clothed in robes, speaking in scripture, and calling itself holy. As the church doors were finally closed for good, the people stood not just in mourning, but in awakening. Evil had worn a face they loved, and they had fed it with trust.